Okay, welcome everybody, and it really gives me huge pleasure to introduce a good friend, elder sister, Sarah Graham. Sarah is an architect who I met when I was working for Arup in Los Angeles, and Mark Angelil, her husband and partner, had organised a symposium at USC on issues to do with technology and architecture. And they invited someone to go from Arup, and I was about the only person there at the time, so I went along. And that was the start of a very long and interesting friendship, a lot of it based on discussions about the built environment and our attitude to how we develop the idea of design. And Sarah will be talking about that this evening in all of her projects. Just to say a little bit about her, she's a Californian, and she and Mark started a practice in Los Angeles, Angelil Graham. They then won a huge competition in Zurich and set up an office there, which is now called Angelil Graham Fenninger Scholl. And that office has a lot of work, and now Sarah's spending more and more of her time in Zurich. Just a small bit of history. She studied art and art history at Stanford University. She did a Master's of Architecture at the GSD at Harvard, and she's taught in many places. In particular, she's taught at RISD, that's the Rhode Island School of Design, and the GSD, and she's an adjunct professor at USC, University of Southern California. And I've had the good fortune to be on a number of juries with her. She's been last year to a number of crits in our unit DIP 13, and has been kind of catalytic in some of her remarks. So I very much look forward to her talk tonight. Thank you very much for coming.
Being introduced by Jane is really quite a family affair. Thank you for inviting me. You know, the AA is one of those schools in the world that has a remarkable presence within the architectural community. And it almost seems as if it's a club that has a membership conferred upon graduation, because there's this fierce loyalty from the people who leave here. Now, I don't know how much of that is attributable to the bar, but nonetheless, it's fantastic, and it really has a name in the world that is only a positive one. I've been asked by Jane in the school to speak about our work, both in Los Angeles and in Zurich. And to begin, I'd like to very briefly introduce a kind of base or a platform for discussion. What I'd like to ask from you, if I may, is I want to set out a series of ideas that we work with, then a series of projects that are in various ways working with those ideas. And I would be delighted if at the end you tell me, are we doing what we say we're doing? Are we not doing what we say we're doing? In other words, to be quite critical of the work, however you want to judge that criticism. Could I have the first slides? The light's not on that one. He promised me it would work. Here we go. As practitioners and educators in our office, we like to work between the realms of theory and the practical arena of construction and production. We tend to view design as a series of laboratory experiments, and in this we see projects as a kind of research in the sense that they involve exploration, experimentation, thesis and counter-thesis. This tends to involve uncertainties and put the work largely at the edge of the field rather than in any central position. We're interested in opening up continuing discussions relating what is architecture today. And it's my hope that at the beginning of the 20th century, we might come to see architecture as an open discipline. This means relating to other disciplines and able to learn from them, and correspondingly, architecture as an open text might be understood from multiple frameworks, not limited to a specific point of view, whatever that might be. We work as a team. We're a collective of individuals in our offices that are in two very different continents, those being Zurich and Los Angeles. It's pretty clear here which was the LA office. And we're very interested, as Jane said, in an interdisciplinary approach. And this means that seeking out specialists in various fields from our normal conspirators, such as engineers and so forth, but also working with energy specialists, biologists, psychologists, and so forth. Whatever might be even possibly appropriate for the work at hand usually informs us more. I believe that our collective field, yours and mine, is complex enough today that it requires the work of a team, and that it's just not possible for a single individual to accomplish much of merit. So therefore, I'd like to argue against the misnomer of the single or the star architect. All of us work in a field that on the one hand is highly precise, like precision procedures, surgical procedures with careful instruments and very small tolerances. And we produce with computers and other means highly technical drawings. And on the other hand, construction is the messy, fast world of improvisation and very large tolerances. We all have to deal with this. So what we try to do is to say this is a kind of dance, it's a dialogue, and that we try to posit ideas and theories that are also elastic, leading to a kind of open-ended problem solving. This was a competition project for a desert museum. What is interesting to me in hindsight is that Mark and I did it operating as a kind of chess game, where we matched move for move in the design process. We had been rereading Roland Barthes' article on the Eiffel Tower and discussing the idea of looking at deep structure, i.e. the structure of relationships of fundamental values versus surface structure, which would be the structure of formal patterns. And this was done to try to analyze and then use some of the local contextual elements within the design process. But it began a discussion for us of how does one work and to be clear about one's process while you're always trying the next step. A similar pattern happened on a very different project. This was the first time we really worked with Jane in her office. The Los Angeles Unified School District asked us to design a prototype structure to shield children from the sun and the rain while eating lunch or now breakfast on various schoolyards. We were to look at 50 different schools and sites, so there was the specificity of each of them being different throughout the entire Los Angeles area, which of course is the size of Switzerland. And at the same time, the prototype structure was to be mass-produced using common construction techniques. All of the shelters were to be potentially transferable to other sites as the demographics of the schools change over time. We developed a structural unit that could, A, fit on a standard truck for construction to the site, and the unit could be multiplied into various configurations to meet the specific needs of each place. The units can generally be connected side by side, connected adjacently, or back to back, producing two overall kinds of volumes. And by simply placing the tapered ribs at different angles to the primary beam, or we called it the backbone, we ended up creating a double curved surface that is completely different viewed from one side to the other. And then these exposed ribs are covered by some heavy sheet metal plates that are just heavy enough to withstand the load of several kids on bicycles who will inevitably climb on them. And in order to have a minimum disruption of the schoolyards, again, we trucked in each of the individual elements, and so the site work was limited to pin connections between the units and at the base, so that the site work only took 1 day per school. And it's interesting how much this is used by the community of Los Angeles, which is, of course, an entirely heterogeneous community. They often become the center for events throughout the day, even local elections and so forth. So it's been great fun. In the Hollywood Hills of Los Angeles, under the D of the Hollywood sign, and here this is an image of Ed Ruscha, a silkscreen of 1968. On a steep piece of land, we wanted to explore a dialogue between typical residential construction of California, which is notoriously rough, and a precision of means that would be expressed through structure and minimal enclosure. We were interested in developing a hybrid order, and in this I'll refer to Michel Foucault's introduction to the order of things. The starting point for the project was a very steep hillside, which was considered, particularly by the neighbors, to be unbuildable. And we recognized from the outset and welcomed the fact that we would need considerable input from civil and structural engineering. On the site, the idea was to produce a house that would be small, but would not be limited to the area of its literal size, and that it would be open, and so that one feels always an expansion of space. And in this sense, we have a spatial organization that's basically a loft. Rooms are not defined per se, so that there is a continuing horizontal and vertical spatial opening, I'll say. And working closely with Arup, we developed a concrete framework where we terraced the steep hillside in accordance with the local zoning regulations. And with the retaining wall at the base and at the top, we created 2 garden terraces that are linked by structural beams. In doing this, we stabilized the hill, and we were able to put anything on top of it. In this case, it became a wood construction, standard American house in terms of its construction systems. And then we have the final project. The house is a very thin wood box with tall double height spaces. And for us, what was interesting, besides the fact that it was a space for people to live in, was that on one hand, it's a world of concrete and working with this very steep land. And then on the other hand, there is the system of the roof. And the roof is fully dislocated from the vertical wall enclosure. So there are 8 beams that only touch the east wall at one point. There's a pin connection, which is then held down by a tension cable, and the rest is a cantilever. So that there is a very small tension cable in the rear that's only working for wind or earthquakes, for uplift. We did this both because we like engineering and because we were intrigued by lifting the roof off the box. We could hold the final west light that's coming in the canyon environment. Construction is interesting. When our idea that American construction is rough, well, we were not at all disappointed. The concrete subcontractor, when he signed our agreement, told us that he worked to 1/4 of an inch per foot. tolerance and a 1/4 inch tolerance total, and when he was setting the steel brackets for a cantilevered concrete stair, the brackets were 30 inches off vertically and 30 inches off horizontally. But considering that the anchor bolts were greater than 1 inch in diameter, even though I threw a fit, that doesn't do anybody any good. The anchor bolts are there, and you end up redesigning the stair. And so that's the reality in construction, at least in the country that I come from. So there was the concrete phase, the steel phase, which was wonderful fun because we wanted to see if we could have the entire system of the walls and the roof held up without any support. We almost could, not quite. And yes, there was an earthquake the night that we put these French fries up, and so luckily no one died. Then the third system in the house is the wood system. And I think it's quite understandable with wood construction why Frank Gehry began his career this way, because every house in the world from the tract house on is quite magnificent when you have this skeletal frame that you can peer through. And it's a fascinating relationship of enclosure and space. When I referred earlier to a hybrid order, one of the ways that was manifested for us is that it's not particularly kosher in structural thinking that the primary steel system is in large part supported by wood. But we were working with whatever we could to minimize the wall enclosure, get the thinnest possible skin as a response to the climate and the light of Los Angeles. With the finished piece, there was also a shift in the primary frame so that our shear walls, at least at the last shear wall, is built in exactly the wrong place, which made our engineer friends crazy, because how can we like engineering and then do it exactly wrong? And we did it consciously because we very much wanted to liberate the last column and beam and allow it to float in space. And now when any of our friends from Arup show up, they always pat this column and they somehow like it. But it was quite an interesting discussion. Also, as a response to the climate, we wanted to open up the house as much as possible to have the walls dematerialize and to blur the distinction between inside and outside. So the garden comes in, the space goes out. After we were out of the ground, this was our house, so it cost us too much, and we spent all our money on concrete. We worked with very cheap materials intentionally. Unlike many of our friends and colleagues in Los Angeles who are architects, masters in texture and form and surface, it's just not particularly an interest. And so cheap materials was an intention. So we have plywood siding. The flooring in the house is an industrial particle board. There's a vertical lift garage door in the dining room, uninsulated, and so forth. The rooms can be made private through sliding partitions rather than doors, but again, there is an interest in spatial expansion to allow you to read the whole and therefore to allow the space to feel more generous than it would be otherwise. And we placed the windows not in such a way as to work with the choreography of canyon views, as it were, but we placed the windows to be peripheral to one's lines of sight as you move through the space, so you're always receiving unexpected views of the landscape. And it's quite fascinating. We live in a city of, we don't quite know, but probably 15 million people, and at the same time it's wild. So by being also adjacent to parkland of the Hollywood Hills, we really have the critters, good and bad, from deer to rattlesnakes in our backyard. And it just becomes quite intriguing to have this mixed experience in Los Angeles. Is it a garden? Is it wild? Is it civilized? Is it city? And it's all of those things. The second house I'd like to show you is on the lake of Zurich. We call it the HT 96-4 house. It was the 4th project of the year 96. And it's located on a hillside slope with access below and views to the Lake of Zurich. This is essentially two houses. And they have a slipped relationship to one another. The upper house is a wood box. The lower house is a concrete box. The upper house above ground was made of 30 prefabricated panels. So again, construction was very fast. That's important because it means that you get more for your money. The concrete house, which is below ground, is the realm of the owner's, somehow I'm off on this, let me try, is the realm of the owner's workshop and cars and so forth and so on. And this was made of precast beams and site poured concrete. Let me try to go forward on one of them. Let me go forward on this one. That'll work. The house itself is the usual program mix for a family of 5. You have common space, private spaces, and backup spaces, as it were. And what is, I think, the most interesting in terms of daily life with this house is that in front of the prefabricated plywood box, we placed a grill of larch wood louvers. And those that are adjacent to the tall windows are the shading devices for and the security for the louvers. So the facade is constantly changing. So when the louvers are closed, you reveal the black painted plywood that would have been on the wall next to the window. When the louvers are open, you see through the house. So there's this constant game of the changing face of the life of the family. The neighbors think it's theater. And then interior spaces, again, the common area. The kids' bedrooms all have glass on the corridor side so they can receive light on both sides. The loft area is the realm of the parents. We sloped the roof in 2 directions, both longitudinally so that at one end of the house we could accommodate a loft, and we sloped it transversely so that in the Zurich climate, which is not unlike your climate here, we could maximize the solar gain on the south-facing wall. And all the bathrooms are organized as islands within this space that are lit from above, so they become these occupied light shafts in the house. The difference of construction between this and the Los Angeles house were remarkable. And it's just because they're a reflection of the 2 cultures. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't get bad concrete work in Zurich. They think this is unacceptable. I think it's better than anything I've usually ever seen. So there become these great discussions where we say, don't make it good, okay? So it couldn't be a more different dialogue. And quite interesting. And the house and the landscape, I think my favorite thing about it is that all of the dirt that was removed for the excavation is placed in front of the house, forming a terrace level along that edge. And this is held in place not by a concrete wall as we had originally designed, but by a grass wall. It works. This is when it was first put in, and a couple times a year the owner goes by with his big electric clippers and whacks it back, and then it grows again with different colors and textures throughout the year. And I want to show you a few bigger projects. Those were the S's, and I guess we're in the M's and L's here. I want to refer, this is certainly not us, this is Richard Serra and his project called Shift. And just for a moment, I'd like to define land art, which we could consider as interventions in an existing context that are often occurring as very precise moves. And the actions such as cutting, digging, and extending could be read as cartographic notes. I think appropriate to architecture and what we were interested in is that land art tends to transform an existing landscape rather than allowing the landscape to simply become the context for the object in question, implying a great dialogue from one to the other. And our next project, which is a town center in Esslingen, Switzerland, outside of Zurich, was based on ideas of land art. I don't think it looks like it in terms of the built form, and I'm critical of it myself, but it was generating the logic of the project. This is a town center. It's a mixed-use program of 50 housing units, retail, office, light industrial space. It's the end station of a light rail train station with post office, station restaurant, lower level parking, and various public spaces. This was an invited competition where we were asked to explore possible definitions for a community that's located between the city and the country. We were asked to look at relationships between living and working and to propose alternative energy use. When we analyzed the context, we found that what humans had done wasn't particularly helpful one way or another. There was stuff built. A rural town was becoming suburban. So we looked to the landscape. And so we based, the architecture is based on various readings of the topography, the water, vegetation, orientation, views to the south-facing Alps, and so forth and so on. So it was really an interpretation of the land. There was a small river that was crossing the site that allowed us to separate the functions where we made a permeable wall that became, in terms of function, office, retail, and light industrial. And this wall then separated the housing from the public spaces to the south. South of the wall, those public spaces, we intentionally organized with a very loose and open set of geometries, and these become the train station, transportation square, and the public spaces. The public realm is the first that has been built, and here is a model in which we were studying simply the textures on the ground in the transportation square. And this is a model we made for an exhibition, again, looking at the quality of the space itself. Like many big projects, this has been built in fragments. And so whenever you work on a project that is really large, know that some things will happen sometime and you don't know which when. That, for me, is another lesson of this project. Because north of the office wall is the housing area, which we wanted to be intentionally not suburban, and it's got a density that's hopefully appropriate to the more private functions of housing, where we have alternating small streets, row houses, and greens, making an urban enclave. Just a couple of sequences of construction shots. I love construction and being on the site. And for me, there are these moments when it's really a performance art or an installation art. And you're not there for that. There's nobody asking for admission to look at the forms of these things. But it's really an amazingly beautiful thing that changes daily. And it just simply gives me great pleasure. The aesthetics vary from place to place. Nowhere in America would you have these things lined up so well. But that's just a different kind of aesthetic. And then with the built pieces, here we have the train station in the context of the near Alps, and again the train station within, and the post office within the landscape. And this, on a typically sunny Zurich day, is the train station square which it functions. It's the end station of the Calatrava train station in Zurich, which I enjoy, since ours is really the little brother. And the details of the place. We realized partway through construction that this was a computer-aided manufacturing office, and we realized we didn't, in terms of the contractor, we really didn't have to make all of these the same. But that was the first time it ever occurred to us that because of the process of fabrication, you can entirely change your way of working. The post office. And this is a client type. All post offices in the world are tough on buildings. So it was great for us. It gave us the opportunity to again have exposed concrete that they again thought wasn't good enough. We were using floor materials that were asphalt tiles and so forth. So the abuse of the program became an asset. The first of the office buildings that is up really focuses its presence on its south-facing wall, which is a multifaceted energy source. We have layers of screens for walking and cleaning windows, of operable screens, interior and exterior, of glass, what am I trying to say? Sun reflectors. There's about 80% of light can be controlled by even in just a barely tinted glass in terms of too much heat gain, light gain. And so it became a whole infrastructure of on one hand wanting to have a south-facing view, and on the other hand wanting to control the light of the workspaces. This is an expensive wall. And this is a wall where everybody both is working in a computer-monitored thermal zone, and they can also open their own windows. We wanted to accomplish everything here. It became interesting. It's a great study. And to me, the question is how to do something like that a lot cheaper. And the building itself is a mix of, on one hand, very high technology, and on the other hand, extremely simple things. We've pre-cooled the air from running an air channel below the building so that you need less heat to cool the air, which is the main thermal requirement in an office building. And on the other hand, we have used recycled materials. We've separated buildings by their lifespans and so forth. So for us, it became a kind of workshop of testing building systems in terms of their lifetime use. And some interiors of the building. Just under construction this week is the Midfield Airport Terminal at the Zurich International Airport, which we won in an open competition working with the Swiss office of Martin Spuler. The competition process is one that's now getting increasingly familiar to architects and engineers, where pre-qualifications were asked for, after which a short list is submitted and you do a paid design competition. I have no idea why we got shortlisted. We were the only ones who were not famous architects and hadn't designed an airport terminal. And that made us really pay attention and kind of hustle. We never imagined we would win. During the competition phase, when we were competing against Richard Rogers and Santiago Calatrava and on and on and on, we realized at one point that the client did not have the money that they thought they did in terms of matching the program to their referendum voted money. So at that point, we altered our strategy entirely away from big space of high technology into something that we called the Poetics of everyday life. We were looking at a really stripped down architecture that was somewhere approaching infrastructure. The idea here was that we would remove anything unnecessary. that we would have an extremely consciously repetitive building where the materials each had to function in multiple ways, and we would not have, or we would require the building's materials to try to lower the system requirements, such as heating and air conditioning, and to push that as far as we could. The jury was interesting. We won the competition, and they told us later that the reason we won was A, we were the only ones who had a conceptual strategy, and B, that happened to be based on an ecological point of view, which is politically correct at the time. The fact that the budget was less than some of the others didn't hurt either. And the idea is that the design strategy was based on several principles. The first one is transparency, that from anywhere in the airport terminal, you have a full view to both the landscape and the tarmac beyond. Again, this notion of the stripped-down aesthetic, where we avoided everything that was unnecessary. And interestingly, now, the biggest problem with the client has been that they want to put more money into nicer materials, and we don't want them to. So it becomes a totally opposite discussion of what usually happens. We wanted the most simple structure we could work with here, and we realized that was the parking structure type, and so that's what we adapted for this building. And, well, I can show it in this or the previous slide, either way. Along the entire length of the terminal, where you are both going to and coming from your flights, we have an entire double glazed zone. And this acts as a thermal barrier, thermal isolator, as it were. So it's a little warmer in the summer and it's a little bit cooler in the winter. But that A gave us space, which we liked a lot, and B, it allowed us to have no air conditioning, virtually no heating, and the only air that is coming in most of the building is just cool air that's been pre-cooled by liquid circulating around the piles of the structural system. This means, it sounds simple and dumb and so what, but in a building that's 500 meters long, if you both don't have any need for any ducts and you don't need the space for those ducts, it's an amazing reduction. So each zone is also computer monitored, but for the amount of air that needs to be released into the space, and we hope it works. Another idea was that for many buildings, but also for an airport terminal, there's a fifth facade potential, this being the roof. So here the airport lounges are on the top of the building, and there is a terrace that those people can access that is both, it's a combination of planted areas and recycled colored glass surfaces. So it really is intentionally making a facade. We have shading louvers that are photovoltaics that usually nobody ever gets these things built because they really don't pay for themselves, but the client decided that that was absolutely correct in terms of the public statement they wanted to make on their airport. For me, the most interesting thing about the project is the big numbers. 500 meters long is 5 football or soccer fields. There is no tolerance for spatial confusion. It's the absolute reduction to the basic. And in that sense, this is architecture that's approaching infrastructure. It's 0-degree architecture. And for us, it's become a quality that anything more gets in the way here. And it's great fun seeing the holes start to be dug in the ground. The last project I want to show you is one that we just won, also in competition, and really had no intention of winning. We were working with urban design strategies that we were more critical of than the client was, and for us they were fairly radical. The client is Adidas Solomon, and they decided that they wanted to reestablish their world headquarters on their traditional base of operation, which is in Herzogenaurach, which is just outside of Nuremberg in Germany. The site was an American military base. Before that, it was a Nazi base that they don't talk about. And the site is enormous. It's 160 hectares, and it will house the world of sports as well as housing and commercial. Again, we were interested in pushing this idea of working with landscape as a real generator for the architecture. And in this case, the topography is the binding element that is linking the various programmatic elements. We've reconfigured the ground conceptually and physically to create lines of movement, to create paths and ways and views in such a way that we are really blurring the distinction between architecture, landscape, and infrastructure. The land itself we see as a structural element that's linking the three zones. We have in the site plan the Adidas campus, which is office buildings and sports facilities, housing, commercial realms, and in the center is a green, we call it the green Y, and that is both going to be the public realm with a common space for kind of more hard surface activities. It will be a place for sports facilities for the community, and it will also take an ecological function. The requirements in Germany are stricter, I think, than anywhere in terms of preserving biotopes, forest, meadows, and actually creating more than we found. The commercial realm is organized as a dense framework of strands that is moving in conjunction with cuts and rises in the landscape from commercial up to a public realm that's all, how can I say, kind of emerging out of the land is the idea. So that programmatically we have green spaces, we have gray as parking, we have orange as building, we have bike paths, and the idea is that these all lace together. And here is a quick programmatic study. We're now in the master plan phase where we're looking at things like parcel use and so forth, but we're also trying to definitely maintain through master planning the idea that the buildings emerge from and out of the land. The housing was conceived as a loose field structure where we think the most beautiful thing on this site is the existing land. Again, it's quite wonderful. And so we were trying to intersperse patterns and textures that one knows from landscape and to pattern them into housing of row houses, duplexes, and single-family houses. And these worms are set along plateaus, step plateaus in the landscape, so they become another base of the stepping territory. So these are the kind of typical patterns and textures that you see in housing that we were trying to work with as an abstraction in terms of figuring out how to cover the land other than little boxes on little sites. And this happens to be a case study of possible single-family use. The world of sports is the Adidas campus that they call the world of sports is a visual landscape. It's a composition of objects within a park environment. And in the center again is this green Y, which will where we will again manipulate the landscape for both sound protection, for taking care of water rainwater requirements, and that the land and the buildings will try to merge, and that's somewhere between the edge of building and landscape. And the Adidas buildings, their campus is one that they asked for security, where on one hand they have boundaries separating their territory from the public realm, And at the same time, there are moments when the public is certainly invited into the campus for various facilities. And we thought it was extremely important that it not be a walled compound, that it not be a corporate park. And so what we're proposing is that through topographic boundaries, there is a viewing potential of this ideal sports landscape, even though security can be provided. And as we were working on it, we called this the zoo factor. And for us, the zoo factor is that zoos are the oldest theme park in the world, where it's absolutely clear who is allowed to move where and see what, for obvious reasons. But therefore, it's a completely choreographed situation. And the campus is organized, the new buildings will be a series of what they called eye catchers. And these were all staged in relationship to specific viewing lines and who is seen, which is seen from which points of view. The idea of these is that as one moves through the spaces, that it's an architecture that's in movement as the land is in movement. This was an urban design competition. So we didn't design these as buildings. We didn't have time, and it wasn't possible. But we had an idea about a company like Adidas and their branding and their image of themselves in terms of their company products that we felt could and should extend to their architecture. So in this case, architecture is a commodity. And so what we did here is that we worked in conjunction with a sculptor, Marco Gantz of Zurich, and we placed his sculptures in the landscape as potential buildings. So the idea of his sculptures rather than someone else's is one, it would be interesting to work in conjunction with a sculptor. And secondly, we weren't pretending that we had designed these, but the fluid dynamics, the movement, the locations of what is smooth and what is bulging and so forth, we felt was appropriate to the fundamental values of sports, of movement, speed, and velocity. And in keeping with our landscape thinking, some of these were sitting on the land, some of them were digging out of the land, emerging from the land, and so forth. And we got the call that we won. We were surprised. We never thought any corporation would like this approach, but they were intrigued by it. So we moved directly into a master planning phase that we're working on now. If we stay in accordance with schedule, then planning will be finished by the end of this year, and then they'll move toward construction. But what's also interesting with corporate clients is the issue of whether this goes forward is in one part dependent upon our work, and on the other hand, it's totally dependent upon their value of their stocks in the stock market and their board of directors' consistency. So you realize that as architects, you do what you can do, and often you're completely out of the decision-making process. And I would call that life. It just happens. Okay. And it just is a concluding statement. Even though we're working with some bigger projects at the moment, we may not be forever, we're quite interested in edge conditions of the field, so to speak, to expand the traditional boundaries of architecture as possible. In doing so, I'd like to just raise a couple of questions. One is I would like to question the role of the egocentrist architect and ask, as the authors, is it not possible that in some of our work we operate more behind the scenes, such as, say, genetic engineering, where it's the information codes and the structure of the work itself that produces, in part, the project. I would also like to refer to aesthetics and its relation to the building process. And I question the role of pictorial, image-oriented form making in the process of design, and want to ask that if production and fabrication processes involve multiplicities, they involve heterogeneous conditions, hybrid realities, could those not inform us into other kinds of aesthetics? I think our work is more speculative than it is conclusive. And what we're really trying to do is we're trying to reconsider and broaden the role of the architect when possible. We're trying to test aesthetics in relation to, again, construction and production, and to view architecture as an open discipline. And we don't really know where this goes in our work or with anyone else's. It requires that one works with a welcoming toward experimentation and multiplicities. It's not predictable, but it's an approach that is trying to promote other orders in the area of inclusion. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. As I expected, you've put forward a set of provoking images which really do show an interest in exploring each idea for itself and to decide what is the appropriate response for each project, which is something that I really appreciate. I know that Sarah would very much appreciate your comments, questions, and discussion. She said to me before, it's very often the discussion after such a presentation that could be more interesting.
So are we doing what we say we're doing? Or are we full of the usual baloney of many architects? Yeah?
Can I ask something else?
Sure.
When you say Los Angeles and Zurich, it seems you cannot go more opposite than that.
That's correct.
And I'm curious to know, on the other hand, it seems that, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems you found your ideal home in Switzerland, your architecture did. And what I'd like to know is both what you take from the places, from Los Angeles and Zurich in your architecture, and the response of these different places to your architecture.
They're opposite, and that's the quality. On a bad day, that's the problem, and on a good day, it's the quality. For me, and when I'm in LA and working in LA, and actually that's where I prefer culturally by far, the knowledge that it's possible to build things well, and it's possible to do things that are not giving up part way, stays with me. Also, we're a little retarded in the States about possibilities of environmental building, which for me are not moralistic issues whatsoever, but they're the possibility of employing other systems and other materials. And so I can take all of that and use it there. Correspondingly, on the other side, the lightness, the quickness that's possible in America, Switzerland could use, and we try. I think that it was actually the values of our house that generated the values of the airport, because we said rough, simple, thin as possible. How do you do it within the climate and the cultural norms? So that intrigues me. I don't love being on Swiss Air all the time, but that's just what's happened. For me, the better place to live is Los Angeles, and at the moment, the better place to work is Zurich, and too bad for me.
Guys, you deal with landscape, which is actually extremely overpowering to understand, specifically to understand and to get a client to understand. I've worked in infrastructure a lot, and I found the debate is at the most basic level with the client, and to be able to take them that journey seems extraordinary, to take Nike to that level or Adidas to that level of discussion and give them that confidence is...
It's amazing to us. When we did the competition, which we thought we won't try to win this. This will be a piano exercise. This is where we're going to test some of our theories of urban design. We didn't even hire Jane or any other consultants to be on this enormous project because there wasn't a chance in hell of winning. And when they said they wanted it, we were totally shocked. And when we met these people, we were amazingly impressed that they had a vision. And They didn't know what we really meant about the landscape, but they knew that there was something that was, if they wanted to take a risk, they could do that, and there was some relationship to how they saw themselves. And all I can say is I hope so far they've been amazing, but I agree with you. I mean, we've just never had clients like that, because usually you're working with these little nickel and diming things. And the irony is that the thing that they're the most intrigued with are these forms, and for us the forms were only symbolic as a first step toward an attitude. And that's okay. They can read it wrong. No, so far they've just been amazing clients. They're absolutely tough, demanding, fair. They get it. So we hope the stock market stays up and the board of directors stabilizes. Anybody else?
Do you want to say a little bit more about the two different cultures' attitudes towards money? I mean, you've said you can't get bad concrete, or that they want to change the concrete in Zurich. Does it cost more?
Well, yes, but everything costs more. I mean, it costs twice as much to buy a pair of tennis shoes or a sandwich in Zurich. Also, there's much more deeply, there are two things, is that there's an idea that architecture is something that lasts a long time, which the problem is not there. The problem is in America, where short-term economics rules our culture, and buildings are not short-term economics. We have a fundamental problem there. And probably it's because of the latter, that American side, where we keep thinking about how do we test, play with, expand the role of the architect, because the architect isn't a player anymore. The architect in the States, because of money, build something that the culture doesn't really care about. We build long-term things that take a while and last a while and cost a lot. So they try to do it as cheaply as possible in the States. You can all judge the consequences. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's horrible. But we're further and further out of the decision-making process, I would say. And Switzerland is more in the 19th century in that sense. They still train people in trades. When the guy shows up to put the plaster on the site, it says, Hans Schmidt Diploma Plaster. And you just can't believe that he knows everything about plaster. And that's great. I mean, the problem is that he really doesn't want to change his mind when you do it differently. So the problems are the opposite. And that's just the way it is. But in general, it is more of a pleasure to have things built the way you draw them. And I think on the funny side of things is in America, particularly in California or the East Coast, the men on the site who are doing the building don't generally speak the language that the drawings are made in. Therefore, it's their incentive not to open even the drawing, because if you say align the beam and the column, they can't read it, and they don't want to admit to their supervisor they can't read it. So it's this enormous problem. But then I realized that the irony is in Switzerland, the people who are on the site can't read the language either, because it used to be that largely the construction workers were Italian, and now largely it's Eastern Europeans. And I thought, what's the difference? If none of the people doing the work can read the drawings, what's the difference? And my only conclusion is that in Zurich, on the site, they can start drinking beer at 9 in the morning. In America, that's forbidden. So maybe, I don't know. I mean, I don't know why. I can't tell you. Except the supervisors in Zurich are highly trained. But it's just it's a totally different set of cultural values. We're always trying to get things rougher over there, and we're always trying to get things better in America. Sometimes I think, why don't we just give up, and in America, let it just happen? And I think Frank Gehry is brilliant conceptually, because he is the first and probably only real architect to turn the roughness and the crudity, not anymore, but in his early work, the roughness and the crudity of American construction into a conceptual strategy. And everybody else has just kind of copied him. I mean, in their office, they used to say, damn the details, full speed ahead. And it didn't matter if it came together like this or like that. It just didn't matter. And I thought, he's the smartest one out there. But you have to think differently about it. I mean, in our house, for example, we said the only thing that has to be precise is they have to measure for the steel beams. They have to get them in the right place. Well, they didn't even get that right. So, but then you just say, okay, fine, you can't change the culture. I like the front row. You guys talk more.
We're alive. But my response to that, in a way, is it's beginning to feel as if one couldn't exist without the other. That in a way that you measure each of those cultures is against the other one, and therefore maybe it's an accident. I don't know why, but working in one place, in a sense, depends on the other. Now,
it does for me now, but that's, and again, I can use it as a quality, but one shouldn't become dependent on it.
Right.
So it's a side thing. It's not what you think about all day long, that you analyze, you find yourself analyzing things this way, you know.
Okay, because you see, I was going to say that actually you've set us a difficult one, because you've said to us, are we doing what we set out to do? And I think my response would be, it's not just your critique of the architect as superstar, it's the singularity potentially of that kind of architecture. And I don't think your architecture is like that at all. I find it very interesting. You talked about the aesthetics of process, in a way.
Yeah.
And when you look at the sort of hybridization of structure and materials, then in a way it's wonderful, because in a sense you're changing all the time, which means it's much harder for us to kind of tick the boxes and say, yes, you are, or no, you're not. But that's a description of your approach.
But you know, in terms of looking at construction and process, it's interesting, because what we have to work with are certain goods, right? We have goods of space and goods of light and goods of systems and goods of materials, and that's what we all have to work with. So if you don't keep changing how you look at that, you die. You get old and you die. And so we don't ever know if it's working or not, but what we do know is that we want to be interested in what we're doing, and you keep trying to manipulate it. I mean, I am very interested in the next project in the States of somehow taking, again, the specificity of what the computer can do in manufacturing times the roughness of the States. I don't know what it'll lead to, but it could be quite interesting. I don't know. Should I let you? I think I should let you go and thank you. You're a good audience and you're all hungry.
And
I
you
appreciate
shouldn't
it.
be thanking us.
No, it's very good.
Thank you very much indeed.
It's very good.